Hi, friends. Trust in God or trust in our leaders? Which is it going to be? And I'm not just talking about like our religious leaders, but also just our civil leaders. Or not just our civil leaders, but also our religious leaders. Do we trust ultimately in God, or do we put so much of our trust in our leaders? That's a question that we can answer from the scriptures. And what I'm thinking of is Numbers chapter 20. And the story is the story of not the Israelites, as often is the case, not being able to trust in God, but it's actually the leader of the Israelites at that time, and that's Moses. So here's the background. The Jews have been wandering in the desert for a long time, precisely because they're learning how to trust in God, how to make Him the center of everything in their life. And the desert has a way of doing that, just stripping us of everything. Desert experiences in our lives where we're all dried up, where we're hungry, where we're thirsty, where everything's been stripped away from us. Everything that's held precious to us is lost. We've sunk pretty low in life, and a variety of things can contribute to it. But we're in one of those type of desert experiences like the Israelites, and they're learning how to trust in God. But they're still not learning, and here's the deal. So they're out in the desert, and they are thirsty. I mean, like in a literal way, they're thirsty. Not just for themselves, but their livestock, and their livestock is dying. And so they're not content. They're discontent, and they cry out, complaining to Moses and Aaron and to the leadership, and saying, listen, this really stinks, and we had it better back in Egypt. So we should just head on back to Egypt again. Head on back to our old ways, which we can do as Christians, whether we're new Christians or lifelong Christians. We can start thinking the grass is greener on the other side, whatever that other side is for us, right? Whether it's forward or sideways or backwards, we often think it's better on the other side. And so that's the situation that Moses encounters. And God bless Moses, because at this point, he just has to be tired of the people complaining and not trusting in God. He's probably close to burnout also. And he is most definitely frustrated with the people, right, that he's called to shepherd. And so just in that midst of his own humanness, the Lord comes to him and says, okay, listen, they want water. Here's the deal. Here's how we're gonna do this. You remember how when you were at Meribah and you struck the rock with the staff, and I told you to do that, and then water flowed from that, and the people and the livestock had all that they need, right? Well, we're basically going to do that again, but here's a little twist to it. I'm just going to ask you to speak to the rock. Don't strike the rock with your staff. Just speak to the rock. And the rock is going to produce the water that you need. So Moses gathers the whole congregation of the people. They're there at the rock again, and Moses strikes the rock not once but twice. And water comes flowing out, and the people are just exuberant and all that. But God comes to Moses and says to him, you didn't do what I told you to do. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that's splitting hairs, the people got their water, right? So what does it matter if Moses struck the rock or whether he spoke to the rock? Well, it matters a great deal, and here's the reason why. And here's how it affects our lives. Moses was relying more upon his own power than the power of God. Moses, human as a great leader as he was, but as human as he was too, maybe got to a point where he needed or thought he needed to show the people that they could still rely upon him, that he's still the leader, he's got the power, and so he strikes it in a physical action, and water flows out saying, see, look at me, right? Whereas what God was trying to teach the people, and not just that generation, but the generation that ultimately would make it into the promised land, is that God himself is going to provide for their needs. That it's not going to be hinged upon the leaders, whether it's Moses now or future leaders. And so what God had asked Moses to do is to pray. Say the words. And then God would answer the prayer. And it would be God's actions, an answer to a prayer, that would give the people what they needed. And then the people would learn to trust more in God than in their leader. Because remember, they're going to wander in the desert for 40 years, meaning most of them, by the time they get to the promised land, they're not even going to be alive, or they're going to be at the end of their life. So it's so important that as they're raising children, which that's what they're doing out in the desert, that their children have experiences from their own parents of how to trust in God more than other people, more than their parents, more than their leaders, civil leaders, church leaders, military leaders, whatever, more than their own selves and their own power. Because this is ultimately what's going to get them into the promised land. And brothers and sisters, that's what's going to get us into the promised land, is heaven. How can we ever, let me just say this, how can we ever expect to get into heaven where we will spend not 40 years or 80 years trusting in God, but an eternity of entrusting our being to the care of God? Because that's what heaven is. 1 billion years, 1 trillion years, quadrillion years of always trusting that God is going to provide for us. I mean, have we ever thought of heaven that way? Because that's what it is. We're going to be trusting him forever. And how can we do that, let alone say that we are capable of doing that, if we don't trust him here and now, when this is where we make the decision to want to be with God or not to want to be with God, based upon whether or not we can trust in him here and now? You get it? I mean, are you following the importance of what is happening here in Numbers 20? Let's look at this from a different angle then too. There are many of us in this day and age who are becoming highly discouraged in our leaders. We're becoming discouraged in our government leaders, in our legislators, in our presidents, in our judges, in our local officials, and some are becoming suspect of our police and of our military and so on. But it's not just civil, right? We're also not trusting in our church leaders and in our spiritual leaders. We're not trusting, as children growing up, in our mothers and our fathers. We're not trusting even in our own selves, right? Whenever some of these leaders fail us, and they do, what do we end up doing? We end up giving up on our government, on our teachers, on our coaches, on our pastors, on our parents, on our spouses. So we say and we act and we feel as if we don't trust them anymore. But the moment they show their humanness and their weaknesses and their sins and their failures, that we abandon them as if everything actually does depend upon them. Right? And when our church leaders, when they fail us, then not only do we walk away from them and we walk away from what they lead, a parish setting, and the church in general, like the Catholic Church, but then we end up walking away from God. And let me be clear here, I'm not talking about a belief in God and how we feel about God and then saying little prayers to God, but we walk away from really living a life centered in God that actually proves that we trust in God, because we are entrusting our entire lives to God. No, we're not. We're trusting our lives to the ways of our culture, to our food and to our job and our money and to our homes and our retirement accounts. We're trusting ourselves to all of that, not fully to God himself. So let's stop playing the games, right? and saying that we don't trust in all these things, but then when they fail us, we actually do kind of trust in them, and so much so that we give up on everything that they represent, like God, or civility, or the common good, and we just are concerned about ourselves, right? In our own little world. And we abandon society as a whole and everything that it represents. Now, the games have to stop, right? And this is like one of those pivotal moments in the scriptures, and then therefore, if we're reading the scriptures and paying attention to it, a pivotal moment for you and I. Moses does not, God tells him right here, because you have done this, you will not enter into the promised land. Now, I'm not talking that he himself doesn't get into heaven, right? Because there's many other ways and many other times that he does trust in God. But he's saying to him, and therefore to the people, Moses is not going to be the one who leads you in. It's going to be Joshua. The one who, in the end, trusted God more than Moses. You know? He's going to be the one who leads them into the promised land. What Moses did may seem like a very small thing, but what Moses did was, rather than glorify God, he glorified himself. Right? Rather than saying, God's going to be the one who gives you this water, he said, look at me, I'm going to provide for you. And we can do the same thing when it comes to raising our children. I'm the one, mom, dad, who's going to take care of all your needs, not God. We might teach them about God. We're not teaching them these deep, experienced, lived out truths about who God is. When they grow up to be kids, then they learn from us how to trust more in their own powers than to entrust themselves totally to God. And then, like you, like me, like any of us, like the Jews themselves, they may not enter into the promised land. And here I'm not talking about Israel, physical space. I'm talking about heaven, where the only way we really do get into heaven through Jesus Christ, who ultimately entrusted his whole self to the Father on the cross, abandoned everything to the Father, and says, I'm entrusting everything to you. I'm entrusting that you're going to resurrect me. I'm entrusting that you're going to get me through this trial and suffering and through this death. That's the trust that we're talking about, because we call ourselves Christians. When we entrust ourselves in this way, when we don't entrust ourselves in this way, then how are we ever going to entrust ourselves to God in heaven for all of eternity? And the answer is we're not. And that's the way we get into heaven, or don't get into heaven. So we live in our lives where we trust more than God, ourselves, and our own powers, in everything else and everyone else in this world, including even church leaders, so that when they fail us, we give up the whole kit and caboodle. The baby's thrown out with the bathwater, right? Or do we trust God even more than ourselves and live that way? And then we will get the promise that God offers us, the promised land of heaven. And here's the beautiful thing too. We will actually be able to live in community and in society where we can learn to trust other people and have them trust in us rather than just live for ourselves. Because that's where our society is going. And we know that. We're becoming more and more of a self-centered society that trusts no one else other than ourselves. And man, does that not only have consequences to us now and our families, but it will have an eternal consequence to each one of us. So we have to ask ourselves the question, who do we trust? And who do we trust most? And that's the way we should be living our lives. And that's not only the thing that's going to get us into heaven, it's the thing that's going to save our church and save our communities of belief and save our law and order and save our society and save our families and our marriages. Until next time.